everyone. Welcome back to the Change Your Mind podcast, where we explore personal development, spirituality, and science. I'm your host, Kris Ashley. We have a really exciting speaker today. She is an astrophysicist turned metaphysician. So I'm really excited for our conversation. It's going to be a great one. First, a couple quick announcements. If you head to the link in the show notes, you will find tons of links. You'll find a link to my book, Change Your Mind to Change Your Reality. It was endorsed by 3 experts from The Secret, Marcy Shimoff, Bob Doyle, Michael Beckwith. It was endorsed by John Gray, who wrote Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. You'll also find ways to sponsor the podcast if you'd like to do some advertising on here. You'll find my courses, some free webinars that I do, lots of really great resources, and you'll find my guest links as well. And let's see, also this podcast, as always, is part of the Los Angeles Tribune Podcast Network. We are doing tons in the personal development sphere, lots of great events coming up, amazing podcasts within the network, so check us out. All right, so hi, I'm Kris. When I was younger, I went through trauma that caused me to feel broken and lost. But my life changed after I had a spiritual awakening. Since then, I've dedicated my life to studying and learning from masters all around the world that have helped me to create a life of fulfillment and abundance beyond my wildest dreams. Now I'm dedicated to sharing everything I've learned so that you don't have to suffer for decades like I did. I've seen people's lives completely transform, and I share it all right here. With me today, I have Kerri Scott. Kerri is an astrophysicist turned metaphysician, and she's the founder of the Soul Selves Framework and author of the book Buddha's Closet, Cleaning as a Path to Enlightenment. As a writer, researcher, grief advocate, and thought leader, Kerri helps spiritual seekers find profound self-love without the need for external validation by guiding their awareness inwards. So, Kerri, welcome. I'm so happy you're here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Kris. I've been really looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, me too. And, we had a pre-call. You told me all about the Soul Selves Framework, so I'm really excited for our audience to get to know it. But before we dive into that, I always start my shows the same way. And that is by asking my guests what their origin story is. So if you wouldn't mind sharing, what is it that led you on this path? How did you get started?
That's a great question. I think what really sort of kickstarted my journey was when I turned 40. On my 40th birthday, I treated myself to a float experience, where you go into a sensory deprivation tank and just float for an hour. And at the time, I was a mom. I still am a mom, obviously, but my children were quite young and I just wanted some solace. I thought this is the best way to have some peace and quiet and time to myself because they were really little. And I'm sure you're probably kind of feeling this yourself as a new mom, there's a lot going on and you don't really get that peace, that time. So I went into the float tank and what I soon realized was that it was actually very, very loud in there. And the noise was all inside of my head. And I had to really draw on my experience with meditation that I hadn't used for a really long time. I learned it when I was in my teens originally. And then, just remembering how to meditate again was a huge awakening. And I went through this process of sort of paying attention to each one of my chakras. And as I moved up, I got to my heart and all of a sudden I had this huge sort of emotional release and realized that there was a huge block there that was keeping me from, becoming more of the person that I needed to be. And so when I left that float experience, I knew there was a whole bunch of grief from, a loss that I had earlier in my life that I hadn't been dealing with properly. And it was time to finally turn the flashlight around inside myself and really explore that. And that just kind of began this whole awakening journey of discovering that there, was so much more to the grief. And it was such a gift to me to be able to spend the time and explore it and just learn all of the ways that I was holding myself back, particularly in terms of not being aware of my thinking. And then, it just kind of unfolded from there, really. So.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And that's funny. I was literally thinking about it. I should go in a float tank for Mother's Day because it's almost Mother's Day. Can I ask who you lost? Who was the grief over?
Yeah, absolutely. So, when I was in my 20s, I dated this fellow, Michael, and the experience that we shared together was unlike any relationship I've ever had. And I consider him my twin flame now that I can look back and um, have a little bit more perspective on what was going on. I didn't know it at the time, but shortly after we dated, he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And a year after his diagnosis, he died by suicide. And so, one of the things that I learned as I was sort of, uncovering this grief or, digging into this grief experience that I had is that often with suicide survivors, there is this term called frozen in grief. And because of the stigma around the death and the mental illness and all those things, I never talked to anybody about it. And so for nearly decades, I just thought I was grieving the way that I was supposed to, the way society sort of expected me to. But what I didn't know is that talking about it and sharing my experience with other people and having conversations with people who'd had similar losses was probably the healthiest thing that I could have done. And so I really find it important to advocate for that now in terms of sharing any kind of loss or any kind of grief and just being able to talk it through, because each time I share my grief, I heal a little bit more and a little bit more.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. And totally, that's why they have support groups, right? Because it's cathartic to process out loud with other people and community. So I totally get that. So I guess the next question would be, a decade later, you realize you're still holding on to this. It's stored in your body, right? Maybe as a repressed emotion or maybe as one that has been suppressed. How did you start to process that grief? How did you start to allow yourself to really feel it to the point where you were able to heal from it?
I think the most important way for me, because I wasn't ready to talk about it, was through writing. And writing was such an amazing avenue for me to really explore what was going on. And it's when I was writing about my experience, I had to go back and relive it to be able to really flesh it out and get to the emotion of it. And as hard as that was to be putting myself back in those situations, it also was so healthy in the sense that I finally was giving myself the opportunity to release all those emotions that I hadn't been releasing, along the way. And so, yeah, just that gift to myself of the time to be able to go in and journal and write and research and learn more about what bipolar illness was, learn more about suicide and suicide survivors, and explore all those avenues. And then reading other people's stories would trigger memories within me that brought back certain emotions and whatnot. And so just all of those little pieces put together over time really gave me the opportunity to finally just be in my grief. And what I learned along the way was that there was this victim part of myself that was really feeling stuck in my grief and hurt because of the loss, and feeling like I could never be a certain way again without Michael in my life. But then as I was able to release all this and learn more about it, it really transitioned into this beautiful experience where now I was able to realize that I can feel the way that I felt with him anytime, because I always felt that way within myself. That was this sort of uncovering of like this gift of self-love that was kind of his gift to me all along, right?
That's so beautiful. I got goosebumps when you were saying that, and I love that you started to process through writing, because writing is so powerful. Everyone talks about journaling, and there's a reason they talk about it, right? Because it works, and it feels like what you were really doing was allowing yourself that space. You said to be in your grief and to feel it, right? You have to. The way out is through, right? You have to allow yourself to feel those emotions. And I also love that you were researching and reading other people's stories. It's something I do too when I'm feeling a certain way and I need to, it's a way of connecting with people, knowing you're not alone. And like you said, it's such a great way to help you start to feel those emotions, right? Like to have those memories come up and trigger something, and then you get to feel that too, right? It's like peeling away the layers of an onion. And I love that you were talking about how you fell into victim mode first, because that's something I talk a lot about on the show. Is, there, if you look out into the world, there's a million reasons to be angry and to feel like a victim. But you can't truly heal when you're in victim mode, can you?
No, 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 that was such a huge realization for me. And when I finally took responsibility for even the littlest things in my life, like I always use the example of leaving a dirty cup on the counter. I would blame somebody else in my family first, and then when I finally like flipped the switch and was like, okay, no, I need to take responsibility for everything that's going around me. Anytime I feel the need to blame somebody, I got to turn it around and take responsibility. And that changed everything, like my mood, my my overall energy level, everything increased because I was no longer blaming anybody else. And even if it wasn't my fault, I still could find a way to take responsibility for that, because maybe I wasn't communicating my boundaries well enough, or my needs, or expressing something that I could have, communicated better in some sort of way. And so everything just got better and better and better when I started taking responsibility. And so when I apply that, like in other aspects of my life, like in the grief scenario, how can I take responsibility? And so much of that was just opening myself to learning and looking at things from a different perspective, and gaining a wider perspective. And then it just unfolded and became so expansive from there.
I love that you
Yeah.
said that too. Looking at it from another perspective, like literally my book, Change Your Mind to Change Your Reality. This is what we teach, right? And it's so important because, like I said, you always have a choice, and you can look at things. The way you look at things changes the way that they feel inside of you, right? And peace of mind can't be found in blaming others or outside events for your problems, right? And by the way, for listeners, I just want to make this point, like this is not people pleasing. Like when Kerri said, like, even if it wasn't my fault, because you really create your own reality, right? You get to decide how you feel at any given moment, and you get to choose happiness, and you get to choose peace, and you really do have an imprint on everything that happens around you, right?
Yeah, yeah, I love how well you articulate that. And I'm almost done reading your book. I'm down to the last chapter, and
Oh, you're so
everything
sweet.
these are all the lessons that I was learning too along my grief journey, really, which became my awakening journey. And yeah, just you just said something, and now I can't remember exactly what it was, but it sparked something for me. Um, Anyways, it'll come back. But yeah, just those those incremental lessons, first of like taking responsibility, and then realizing that I have choices and I'm in control, and then realizing that I'm able to choose the thoughts that I'm thinking. That was like such a pivotal moment for me. And then that eventually led me to realizing, beyond that, I can become an observer of my thoughts and of my emotions and of my actions. And that perspective just kept getting wider and wider and wider. And then at some point you just kind of become consciousness, right? Your awareness goes from not having any awareness at all, sort of being a victim, to becoming completely conscious and aware of everything and anything all at once, sort of thing. So yeah, it's been such an amazing unfolding, and I'm so grateful for my grief in that regard. And I think one of the things that's been so interesting along this journey is that grief has been my path, but everybody has their individual paths that brings them to these same sort of places. And it's so wonderful to have these conversations, to learn about all the different avenues that people are arriving at this sort of same place.
It's so interesting and by the way, I love everything you just said. I was like, yes, yes, yes. But it's so interesting that you said everyone comes from a different path and gets there, because most of my guests have been through a trauma, of some sort, right? And they have come to that crossroads where they're like, okay, I can either stay a victim, I can just get caught up in this resentment, I can become angry and bitter, or I can heal and become better and take responsibility and level up and grow. And those are the stories that I love hearing, right? Those are the inspirational stories, and it's so fun how so many of us have come to these same conclusions. And I love how you were talking about you can become an observer of your thoughts and you step back and pretty soon you are consciousness. Like, it's so funny how we can get so unconscious and tied up in our thoughts and our emotions, and they just control us, right? Like, most people are going around 100% controlled by their thoughts and emotions, right? And it's just, they're like on these like hamster wheels. But we are so much more than that, right? It's like this surface layer, and we are so much deeper. Okay, so you said something interesting. You said your grief was your awakening. So talk to me about how that was a spiritual awakening for you, and how did you come to become even more conscious because of this?
Ah, so there's been so many little things that have added up to this bigger experience. And initially, like when Michael and I were dating, our relationship was really based in spiritual conversations. And I think at the time he was quite awake, and everything he said just resonated with me in such a deep way that I didn't even fully understand. But there was this, like, this sort of truth to his understanding that felt really grounded when I heard him speak. And so after he died, anytime I would go into sort of a spiritual experience, whether it be yoga or meditation or something like that, he was there. That grief was so huge, you could say, that it was too painful for me. And so I really withdrew from that spiritual part of myself because I didn't want to just feel that depth of grief in that experience. Like, for instance, going into yoga class, at the end of the class, there's always shavasana, as you know, being a yoga teacher, and that stillness was always just an instant avenue to grief. But what I've learned now that I've had the opportunity to sit with this more and be present with it is that it felt like grief, but grief can be many emotions. It's not just sadness, and it's not just pain, but it's also love and awareness, and all of these things. And so when I go into stillness and I find him there, it's just that connection that is always there. And he's really been present for me all along this awakening experience. It's almost like, he's been dropping breadcrumbs, and I've just been picking them up and learning about this piece, and then learning about this piece, and finding this teacher and finding this story, and I've just been following all of these avenues of information and exploration and expansion, just guided by spirit, essentially. And I'm so grateful now to be able to have that connection, on that deeper level, because it's really dropped the illusion of separateness, and I think, as I've been able to experience it personally, I've also been able to sort of look at it, um, from that sort of philosophical perspective, I guess you could say. And like, I've come up obviously with my own understanding of what has been happening, so that, I can hopefully share that with others to help them understand what's happening along their awakening experience. But it's very much been a lived experience for me. Just dropping again that illusion of separateness, of me being an individual and separate from everything else that is. And one of the big lessons, and what I feel so called to share, is that we are looking so often outside of ourselves for this sort of external validation or satisfaction, when really, when we're able to turn our awareness inwards, then we find that lasting satisfaction or sense of fulfillment is within all of us. And again, that sort of returns us back to that idea of consciousness, where we're just all connected. And um, it really changes our relationship with our external world, because we're no longer dependent on things outside of us for fulfillment. And we realize that that fulfillment that we're receiving is just temporary, right? Again, like you said, the hamster wheel, we're just going around and around and around looking for the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And so once we're able to make that distinction, it's really fundamentally, life changing, as you know. So yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that was so beautifully said. And also what a beautiful gift that you received from Michael through all of this, right? Where he was leading you with these breadcrumbs and you were able to reconnect with the spiritual side of you. And that's even where it started. So that's, and so often people will say like, "Oh, I'm so sorry you went through that," right? But and it's a horrible thing to go through. But you took it as a lesson and you learned and you grew from it and you awakened from it. And it was this catalyst for growth from you. And that's such a beautiful and powerful place to be now, right? To have that distance and look back on it. And, I like that you were saying like grief is more than just like sadness, right? It can be so many emotions. It can be anger, it can be love, it can be all of these things like you were talking about. And it reminds me of the what is it, the 5 stages of grief that we all go through. And I know that you write about the 5 stages of awakening as well. And I would love and I didn't even make the connection until you were just talking, like wow, this really is running in parallel for you, right? Because we go through these stages of grief, and as you were doing that, you were also going through these stages of awakening. So it's just like another layer of this like beautiful synchronicity happening for you. But I'd love to hear about your 5 stages of awakening, right? That you see most people go through.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I call them the Soul Selves Framework, and there are 5 markers that I've come up with to help kind of determine where I am at any point along what I sort of see as a spectrum. So at one end there is the ego, and then at the other end is the soul. And so um, I like to use metaphors a lot when I'm explaining this. And so one of the ways that I like to share it is like when you have a prism and you shine light through a prism, the light comes out like a rainbow on the other side. And so we give, each color that we see emerge from the prism a different name, and like red, yellow, all those sorts of things. And so for me with the soul cells, it's like we take consciousness and shine it through the prism of our bodies. And what emerges is this, again, this spectrum of the 5, what I've labeled the 5 markers or stages. And the first one is the bodily self. The second is the vital self. The third one is the thinking self. The fourth is the observer self. And then the last one is the transcendent self. And so we can be really rooted in one of these selves for a long time, or, we can move from one to another and back again, within minutes or hours or days. And so we're always kind of moving along this spectrum. And one of the really interesting things that I've learned too is that we can be at different places in our awakening experience in different aspects in our lives. So for instance, I use the example, like I'm often still really rooted in my bodily self when it comes to money and prosperity. But I've also experienced like transcendent self-love. And so, yeah, we can look at each aspects of our life and kind of determine where we fit into that into those markers.
Okay, first of all, I love the imagery of the prism of consciousness coming through. That's just such a beautiful image. And I really appreciate that not only are these not linear, right? Like you can move back and forth because that takes a little bit of the pressure off because sometimes we're meditating for hours and we're so enlightened and then the next day someone's cutting us off at traffic and we forget it all, right? For a moment. And it happens and we're human. So, if that's you, it's all of us, right? Or most of us. And then I also appreciate that you can be different levels at different aspects of your life. That totally resonates because I hear that because we are on 3D Earth, right? And as someone who's also running a business, that totally resonates with me. And again, it allows us to be human a little bit, right? It's not like this pedestal that we're trying to put ourselves on that just feels really unreachable. Can you walk me through each of those 5 stages in a little bit more detail?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I want to say too, like, it's really important to me to make the distinction that no stage is better than any other stage. Like, wherever we are in this process is divine, because it is essentially all that root, like that light of consciousness, just spread out in a spectrum. And so there's no destination. We're not all trying to get to the transcendent self because it feels better than being in the bodily self, but um, it does ultimately, the differentiation. I'm not saying that properly. uh, Between them is just how we feel at any given stage. So starting with the bodily self, like we talked about earlier, often one of the things that I've noticed that really identifies being in the bodily self is that we're feeling like a victim and we're blaming other people. And essentially, we're really rooted in our ego at this particular time. We don't have a great amount of awareness. We probably don't have really any self awareness when we're in the bodily self. We're operating from a place that is conditioned, which is all totally normal. This is part of the human experience. As we go, you know, from our childhood into adulthood, we pick up all these beliefs along the way. We don't really question them necessarily in the bodily self. We just are reacting to life as it's coming at us. So when we move then into the vital self, this is when I say we start taking responsibility. So there's something that happens. I've kind of identified 4 different areas that are vital self moments, I call them. The first one would be like a soul glimpse, where you're maybe watching the sunset and you're so moved by the beauty of it that all of a sudden your soul can kind of like drop in, and you have this really wonderful experience. And those can happen all the time, when we're doing art or dancing or listening to music. Then the next one, which is a little more profound, I guess you could say, would be peak experiences. And I borrow that word from Abraham Maslow. And this is what I feel happened for me personally when I first hugged Michael. It was like a peak experience where all of a sudden, within that embrace, like the whole sort of cosmic energy, rushed through us. And that was like this bright green flash. And we kind of were removed from reality and thrown into this sort of cosmic experience that was like everything everywhere all at once, and both of us were just sort of like wowed by what had just happened. Maybe kind of like often could be referred to as like a kundalini awakening or something along that line. And then the next one I call disidentification, and that's where often you hear a lot of spiritual teachers talk about this, where they were so incredibly rooted in their ego, so depressed or just like so traumatized and in their thoughts, in their mind, that their soul is essentially sort of had to step in and like kick the ego out. So all of a sudden they went from this like incredibly heavy, sort of depressed place, and it's like a switch flipped, and they lost that sense of identity altogether, and they just went into sort of pure consciousness. So there was this sudden delineation of one to the other. And then the fourth one, which is a new understanding for me that I'm still sort of exploring, is this idea of psychosis. And often you hear people on their awakening journeys kind of being not fully disidentifying, but then kind of stuck somewhere between identifying and like having an ego, and then somewhere having a soul experience. And it can be really disorienting and confusing, and often, and sadly, it's misdiagnosed or not caught, because I think in the Western medical field specifically, this isn't necessarily a recognized sort of like path of awakening, but rather we medicate it and uh, go into other sort of treatments that really sort of suppress what's going on. Anyways, that's a whole other story. But in terms of the vital self, it's when you first have that glimpse that something needs to change, right? So then we move into the thinking self, which is a lot of what I find your book describes so beautifully. And it's when we realize now we've got the ability to control our thinking and ability to choose our thoughts. And this is when we start exploring all of the different modalities to do the healing, to do the work, to heal the trauma. And I mean, there's just so many different avenues that you might dabble in many of them, or you might just pick one that works really well for you to help move through all of the things that are surfacing as you're in this experience. I've kind of grouped the modalities into 3 different groups. So the first one's energy awareness. So you're bringing your awareness to something, maybe through breath work, or yoga is sort of an overarching one. And then the second stage or second sort of group of modalities is energy movement. So now you're getting that energy to move through your body and go in, just sort of activating things and making things happen. And then the last is energy clearing. So you're actually moving that energy and transmuting it and moving it on. So yeah, there's this is a very like light skim over the surface of all of this, but just yeah. Anyways, then from the thinking self, we move into the observer self, which is essentially that is you become an observer. Now your perspective is stepping back again, and you're just witnessing that you have these thoughts, and you're witnessing how you're reacting in certain situations or responding, and what your emotions are. It's I love the observer self in the sense that it's so calming when you're able to be there. And I like to use the example of like those 3D images. I don't know if you remember them. They're obviously all over the internet now, but when I was younger, you could go to the mall and there'd be like a 3D poster, and you'd stare at it and try and figure out what the image was. And so, you're looking at this image of all these different colors and shapes, and it's not entirely clear what it is. But then when you shift your perspective just that right way, all of a sudden this image, just moves out from the poster, and you're immersed in it, and you can sort of move to the left, move to the right, up and down, and you can still see this 3D image. And that's kind of how I feel when you connect with that observer self part of you. Is there's just this subtle shift of perspective, this subtle shift of awareness, and you're interacting with yourself in an entirely different way. And it's very peaceful, and there's a lot of grace and surrender and non-attachment. Those are sort of the terminology that I hear people use a lot when they're in the observer self. And then lastly, we move into the transcendent self, and this is a tricky one to explain, because when we're in the transcendent self, when we're in consciousness, we're no longer in the mind. And so it's hard to use words that are created from our mind to explain something that is beyond the mind. But one of the common experiences that I've heard people in various awakening situations describe this is that they no longer are using the terminology I or me or they or them, even like here or now. Like these concepts of space and time and individuality all just completely disappear, and there's just is no understanding of that separation anymore, because everything is connected in a way that is really beyond our comprehension until you experience it. It's not something that you can just explain someone into, but you really have to have that experiential experience to understand it. But I think it's beautiful, and like I said, you could go from the bodily self to the transcendent itself, in a split second, and then back, and or you're taking very small sort of incremental steps between each one, and yeah, there's no right or wrong. It's all there as a possibility, but yeah.
What an amazing breakdown. No, I really enjoyed listening to that. And as you were talking, I was trying to put my experiences to different levels, and just things I've read about. Like the transcendent one reminded me of near death experiences that I've read, right? Because I've gone down those rabbit holes where it's like you just feel this oneness with everyone and it's just pure love, right? And there's no anger, there's no resentment, there's no victim or blaming. It's just this connection. Wow, how powerful.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Have you
So
experienced all of these levels?
I believe that I have. Yeah, absolutely. I think with the transcendent self, like I know that in my peak experience with Michael, that is what he shared with me. That was, his gift to me, was to have that sense of unconditional love that just was and could be, and the separation between him and I, just disappeared often when we were together. But I've found a way, and it's not something that I can replicate as often as I would like, and I probably shouldn't even be trying to replicate it. But I think that's part of our journey, is we try to get these experiences back. But I can actually do sort of like a talking meditation where I talk myself through each of these stages, in terms of like self love, and then I can get to this place where I just sort of feel like I am a fountain of love that is just flowing, and I fill myself up first, and then I just can overflow with love, and just be in this really blissful state, for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. And when I'm there, I'm just reminding, this is the most powerful thing that I can do as a human being, is to just return to this state and hold it as long as I possibly can, and just be present and overflow that love. And I notice when I do that afterwards, the things that are in my awareness and what seems to be like attracted to me afterwards are all love. Like, there's love stories, and you find heart-shaped rocks on the beach, and people are sharing quotes about love online, and like my whole experience with the external world completely changes. And I think that has just reinforced that learning that you talk about in your book, that like when you change your mind, the things around you change, and I'm in control of that. And so what I'm choosing to put my awareness on is what is going to be reflected back to me. And so, yeah, the more opportunities I can do that, the more I benefit from that, and hopefully other people around me can benefit from that as well. Yeah.
Well, that's the amazing thing, right? Because you're rubbing off on the people around you, and it creates this beautiful ripple effect, right? And I love that you said after these moments, there's just love everywhere you look, right? It's this tangible proof that our inner world creates our outer world. And I think a lot of people have tapped into that state before. I know I have, with certain meditations, or like an acupuncture session that put me in this crazy blissful state. Or, there's these moments that we understand that we're so much more than just this, right? This physical body. And and I think you're right that that is one of the most powerful things we can do in our human life, is to find that state where we are pure love and pure connected. Because I don't know about you, but like for me, after, I just felt like so much love for everyone around me too. I felt so connected. I remember like riding like BART after one, like the Bay Area Rapid Transit, the train here after, and just like feeling so like much love and connection for every single person around me, right? I wasn't like cranky with how overcrowded it was, or like whatever. And instead it was just like this like immense love for people. And
Yeah.
like we talked about, we're human, those states don't stay, but it's just such a peaceful, wonderful place to get to.
It really is. Yeah. 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 It's so beautiful. You described that so well. You took me there just listening to you. Yeah. Pretty fantastic.
And I had forgotten about that moment. So like you reminded me of like, oh yeah, I have had those moments where I just felt this profound love and connection for people, for strangers. And it was like, oh, we're all one. We're all the same.
Yeah. Yeah. It really it expands your compassion too. And the
Yeah.
more, work that you do on your own, repressed traumas and conditioning and all that, you just realize that, we all have had these layers of our ego put on us, and whether we understand that they're there or not, they're shaping the decisions that we're making and the conversations that we're having, and so it becomes so much easier to be compassionate for that person who may not understand what's going on and is reacting in a certain way, but you understand that they've been conditioned to react that way, and um, they may or may not discover that that's a choice that they have to change that sort of thing. So yeah, it
Absolutely.
really changes your relationships and the dynamics of them too.
Absolutely. And compassion is such a good word for it. And yeah, you have this understanding for people like they're just another soul,
Yeah,
right? Like they're incarnated in this world just like you are. And I love it. The conditioning, like everything placed on top of them is just, it's not their essence of who they are.
yeah,
And who they are is really who you are too, right? Like you can't like when you're fighting like the outside world, you're fighting yourself, right? When you're having aggression towards another person or judgment or blame, that's really coming back at you because they're a reflection of you.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I really appreciate you for just bringing all this up today because we haven't had this kind of conversation specifically on the podcast yet. And it's just such a good reminder to me as well that of those moments, right? Of those moments and that feeling. And I think you said it well that you can't really put them into words. It's such a feeling.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I know. I'm so fascinated. I have to admit, because that's where the duality comes in, and words are part of the duality because they come from our mind, but we're experiencing something again that is beyond our mind. And so, how do you describe something with words that um, isn't even? It's completely well. I shouldn't say separate from it because then we get into that whole dynamic again. But yeah, just the sort of like irony of it all is it's so beautiful and delicious to me.
Totally. Yeah. It's just like another beautiful facet of this life, right? This beautiful experience called life.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, is there anything that you really want to share with people or leave people with today, or something we haven't touched on that you think is important to talk about?
Oh my goodness. I think one of the things that I go back to often is just this idea of challenging your beliefs, because our thoughts, and I get this from Abraham Hicks, but our thoughts that we keep thinking turn into our beliefs. And so when we realize that we can choose the thoughts that we're thinking, then we can also change the beliefs that we have. We're not Our beliefs aren't fixed to who we are. They make up our identity, but they are so malleable when you really start to like look at them and unfold them. And so to the just this idea of challenging your beliefs often, I think is a really good way of sort of beginning to question who you are, and opening yourself up to this, incredible expansion that is available to all of us. Yeah.
Well, you're speaking my language when you talk about challenging your beliefs. And I say this in the book too, but it still like just blows my mind that if you look up the word belief in the thesaurus, one of the antonyms for it is truth. So literally the opposite of belief is truth. And if you think about it, like you said, our beliefs come from other people's opinions or our own thoughts or are based on our lived experiences, right? But none of that is truth, right? It's all our own opinion or the opinions of others. So really our beliefs are lies that we tell ourselves. And like you so perfectly said, like we form our identities around these lies. And then you become so fixed in this one way of looking at things when really there could be a completely other perspective on any given situation that would completely open you up to this new reality and change your life. So thank you for bringing that up. I really, really appreciate that. Okay, I'm sure everyone wants to get more nuggets of truth from you. They want to hear about your book. So where can people find you? How do they connect with you? What are you working on? All the things.
Yeah. So my website, kerriscott.com, is the best way to get more information about the Soul Selves Framework. I have on there a quiz, which is specifically for the Soul Selves Framework. And it's a really fun little short quiz that when you take it, it's going to tell you kind of overarching, like where you fit in that spectrum, like what soul self you're sort of or like spending the most time in at any given time. And then it goes into a little bit more detail about that specific soul selves, and then you can look at all the other ones. So if anybody's interested, that is a great way to learn more about that framework in particular. And then I am currently working on my first solo book, which, as you mentioned earlier, is Buddha's Closet, Cleaning as a Path to Enlightenment. And it's just again, a playful look at the relationship between fashion and spirituality. And as I mentioned earlier, I love using metaphors to sort of help explain a lot of these spiritual experiences and teachings. And so I took fashion metaphors in this case and tried to apply them, or I shouldn't say try, I applied them to spiritual, and then drew a parallel between like cleaning out our closet and cleaning out our mind. So each item of clothing in our closet really represents a thought that we're thinking. And, are we going to put that back in our closet, or is it time to maybe move it on? So that will be out in mid-June. So really excited to share that with everybody.
And we all know how good it feels to just shed old clothing and clean out, like spring cleaning. So imagine applying that to your mind. And you were so sweet as to send me a copy of the book. So I'm really excited to start reading it and write you a little endorsement. So everyone, go take that quiz. I'm going to go take that quiz. It sounds really fun. Go check out Kerri. Buy her book when it's out. And if this episode resonated, like, share, comment, subscribe, send this to someone you think could benefit from it. And I think everyone could benefit from this information. So thank you so much again, Kerri. It was really wonderful having you on. I appreciate your time. Thank you, listeners. Have a beautiful rest of your day, everyone.